It was supposed to be a regular day on the Galactic Council's most advanced space station, a station fortified with technology from across the galaxy. The aliens on board were highly trained, meticulous, and efficient. Their protocols were flawless, their equipment was unparalleled, and they believed they were prepared for any crisis. But today, something had gone terribly, inexplicably wrong. Alarms blared. Emergency lights flashed. Alien officers darted through the halls, barking orders, their faces a mix of confusion and panic. Their greatest achievement, a fusion reactor that powered the entire station, was spiraling out of control. A critical failure they hadn't prepared for, a breakdown beyond the scope of their carefully structured protocols. The Galactic Council sent out an urgent call for help, activating every fail-safe and emergency contact across the cosmos. But no response came, except from one lone Earth engineer who happened to be passing through the nearby sector. As he boarded the chaotic station, the alien stared in disbelief. He was calm, unbothered, even amused. Holding a half-full mug of coffee and a small toolkit that looked laughably primitive, the human scanned the scene, sighed, and muttered, "All right, let's fix this mess." To the Galactic Council, humans were strange. Useful, yes, in limited capacities, usually where raw labor or physical endurance were required, but odd. Aliens didn't understand humans' fascination with things like coffee, a bitter liquid that seemed almost ritualistic for Earthlings. Nor did they understand humans' calmness in the face of what aliens considered catastrophic. This was the setting in the briefing room before the human arrived. The top minds of the council had gathered, their faces etched with an unusual combination of dread and anticipation. They had read reports of human adaptability, their stubborn insistence on survival even when the odds were mathematically unsound. The Galactic Council's Director of Crisis Protocol, a tall, thin creature with pale green skin and 3 eyes, addressed the room. "This situation is unprecedented. Our station's fusion reactor is in critical condition, and our primary, secondary, and tertiary protocols have failed. Our systems are, as you say, scrambling." He paused, his voice betraying a rare hint of nervousness. "A human is en route." The room fell silent. Eyes shifted, antennas twitched, and tentacles subtly tightened. The whispers began almost immediately. "A human? But they're so disorderly. Does anyone understand how they operate? I heard they rely on something called duct tape for their repairs. They say they sometimes make things worse before they improve." The director raised a hand, silencing the whispers. Yes, we all know the rumors, but we must remain open-minded. Humanity, as baffling as it is, possesses unique qualities." One officer with deep blue skin leaned forward. "If I may, Director, I read a report where a human supposedly repaired an entire space station with duct tape and a wrench." The other aliens gasped, clearly horrified. "Ridiculous," another scoffed. "They'll get us all annihilated." "But they may be our last option," the director interrupted, bringing order back to the room. "Our protocols have failed, and no other response team is within range. This is a desperate measure, but we have no choice." As the human ship docked with the station, nervous energy rippled through the alien crew. They exchanged uneasy glances, muttering their anxieties in hushed tones. "He won't actually drink that coffee stuff while he's working, will he?" "I hear they drink it constantly," someone else whispered, "like it's an engine oil or fuel source." "Disgusting," another muttered, visibly recoiling. The aliens were used to control, precision, and an orderly hierarchy of tasks. Their entire culture revolved around meticulous planning, methodical execution, and strict adherence to protocol. They wore uniforms of sterile whites and calming blues, and by contrast, this human wore a stained jumpsuit and held that strange mug with the word "World's Okayest Engineer" emblazoned on it. When he finally stepped into the main control room, the entire crew collectively held its breath. The human took a moment to survey the blinking control panels, the intricate alien machinery humming with unfamiliar sounds, and the tense faces staring at him with barely concealed skepticism. He took a casual sip of his coffee, seemed to nod to himself, and with a nonchalant shrug, muttered, "All right, point me to the problem." The aliens blinked, still processing the sheer casualness of this human. Didn't he realize the gravity of the situation? Didn't he understand the crisis they were in? One brave alien officer finally spoke up. "The reactor, human. It's—" Yeah, a reactor meltdown," the human interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "Happens more often than you'd think. So, show me the way." The aliens were frozen, stunned at his lack of urgency. They had run the calculations. They knew the odds of survival were plummeting by the second, but here he was, moving as though he had all the time in the universe. One officer, his voice tinged with disbelief, whispered, Do you think he's aware of the stakes?" "Oh, I'm aware," the human replied, as though reading their thoughts. "I'm also aware that panicking won't fix it. So are you all just going to stand there, or are we going to get to work?" It was in that moment the alien crew realized this was going to be different. This human's approach went against everything they had been taught, every procedure they'd memorized, every protocol they'd perfected. But they had no choice now. This was the best and only chance they had left. The human engineer strolled through the labyrinthine halls of the alien station with the ease of someone who'd been there 100 times before. The alien officers, meanwhile, followed him closely, exchanging looks that ranged from skeptical to downright horrified. Every step he took seemed casual, almost leisurely, yet they knew every second counted. The reactor control room was a whirlwind of blinking lights, flashing screens, and an ominous hum that signaled just how close they were to catastrophe. Panels labeled in alien script monitored intricate readouts, flashing with dire warnings. One alien technician looked as though he might faint as he watched the reactor's temperature climb. But the human? He raised an eyebrow, took another sip of his coffee, and approached the reactor panel like it was an overly complicated coffee machine. One officer, who could no longer hold back his disbelief, finally spoke up. "Human, do you have any plan at all? Or is this casual behavior typical of your species?" The human chuckled. "Trust me, pal, if we humans panicked every time a reactor went on the fritz, we wouldn't have made it out of the 20th century." He glanced at the reactor display, then reached into his tool belt, pulling out a roll of duct tape. The aliens gasped. One of them whispered, Is that the duct tape?" The human looked up, raising an amused eyebrow. "Yeah, you guys seem pretty fascinated by this stuff. Works wonders, by the way. Got me out of more messes than I can count." He tore a piece of tape and smoothed it over a small crack in the reactor housing. The aliens watched in horrified fascination, one whispering to another, "How primitive." But the display showed a slight improvement. The reactor's temperature dipped, if only by a fraction. The human grinned, satisfied. "See, nothing to it." One alien technician wrung his hands. "But human, that's not even close to a permanent fix. Surely you don't intend to rely on that?" The human shrugged. "It'll hold for now. Buys us a little time to figure out the next steps, don't you think?" He winked at the technician, who could only stare, mouth agape. As he worked, the human explained his process aloud, in part to ease the alien's evident anxiety, but mostly because he enjoyed the dramatic flair. "Now, here's the thing about reactors. They're kinda like old, cranky engines. Sometimes all you need is a bit of a workaround while you figure out the real fix, sorta like coaxing an old truck to get you one more mile, you know?" The aliens, who had no idea what a truck was, glanced at each other, baffled. The human's nonchalance was unsettling. They were accustomed to precise calibrations, intricate planning, complex equations. And yet here he was, talking about reactors as though they were temperamental pets. One officer, visibly bristling, tried to argue. "But our protocols specify that any repair on the reactor should involve multiple redundant systems. We need schematics, simulations, calculated risk assessments." The human waved a hand dismissively. "Listen, your protocols might work on a good day, but right now, we need to get creative. Just trust me." He paused, chuckling. "Besides, if this doesn't work, I'll buy everyone here a round of coffee." The aliens looked at each other in horror. Did this human really not grasp the gravity of the situation? Did he think this was a game? "Human!" one of the technicians exclaimed, trembling. "Are you mocking us?" The human put his hands up in mock surrender. Whoa, no mocking. Just saying, I've been in tight spots before, and sometimes the only way out is with a bit of spit and a lot of luck. You'd be surprised at what a little bit of creative thinking can do." The aliens recoiled, unsure whether to feel insulted or intrigued. They watched as he began to twist wires together, bypassing several systems with makeshift connections that looked, well, haphazard at best. He added a few more strips of duct tape and, in a particularly bold move, jammed a pen cap into one of the control panels to keep a switch in place. One alien could no longer hold his disbelief. "Is this normal for your species?" The human grinned, glancing back. "Only on the days when things are really falling apart." He could see their skepticism, so he added, "Look, you guys seem big on rules, protocols, simulations. Very impressive stuff, really. But sometimes you just gotta wing it. Trust the process, you know?" The alien officers whispered among themselves. Wing it? Trust a process with no protocols? This is madness. Yet somehow, in the midst of the chaotic methods and baffling improvisation, the temperature on the reactor display was stabilizing. The alarms were quieting down. The system wasn't fixed, but it was no longer on the brink of immediate collapse. One alien finally spoke up, daring to ask the question on everyone's mind. "Human, how can you be so calm in a moment like this?" The human smirked, taking another sip of coffee. "Calm? It's just experience. This kind of thing happens all the time. Part of the job. Plus, a little caffeine doesn't hurt." The aliens exchanged stunned looks, some visibly perplexed, others starting to show a glimmer of admiration. Was it possible that this human knew something they didn't? That his chaotic methods weren't just random, but a different kind of wisdom? One technician muttered, Perhaps there's more to these humans than we anticipated." The human, overhearing, chuckled. "See, now you're getting it. Sometimes it's not about following a perfect plan. Sometimes it's just about doing what you can with what you have." He gave them a thumbs up, which only puzzled them more. He continued to work, explaining his process in simple, almost absurd terms like, "We just need to give this thing a timeout, or think of it as a stubborn door that needs a little nudge." Each analogy left the aliens even more confused, but they couldn't deny that his efforts were working. The more the human worked, the more their initial skepticism was replaced by a strange fascination. They began taking notes, jotting down observations about his methods, his attitude, even his choice of tools. Some of them couldn't help but wonder, could there be some value in this human way of handling crises? As he wrapped up his patchwork repairs, the human looked over his shoulder and grinned. "All right, that should hold for a bit. Now who wants to take bets on how long this fix will last?" The aliens looked at him, bewildered. Betting on failure? The concept was alien. But as they glanced at the reactor's now stable readings, a few of them dared to let a tiny spark of hope, and perhaps admiration, flicker in their minds. Just as the aliens began to grasp the humans' unconventional approach, a new problem reared its head. A loud, ominous hum filled the room, and the reactor's temperature began to spike once more. Monitors displayed a cascade of errors, each more dire than the last. The aliens froze, their expressions shifting back to panic. One officer spoke up, his voice shaking. "Human, your repairs aren't holding. The reactor is destabilizing again. We need a real solution." The human took a long sip of his coffee, visibly unfazed by the worsening situation. "All right, looks like we're dealing with a bit of a meltdown. Fun times." He pulled out a pocket-sized multi-tool and popped it open, much to the aliens' horror. They watched in silent dread as he approached the control panel, nonchalantly jabbing wires together with the tool as if he were tweaking a radio rather than saving an entire station from destruction. Are you sure you know what you're doing?" asked one technician, clearly distressed by the sight. "Oh, about 50-50, the human replied, grinning. "But hey, what's life without a little risk, right?" He winked at them, which only seemed to amplify their concern. He cut a wire, causing a cascade of sparks that made several aliens jump back in fright. The alarms immediately escalated, blaring louder than before. One alien officer cried out, "Human, you've just activated the emergency override. This is dangerous." The human rolled his eyes. "Relax. Dangerous is just another way of saying exciting." He yanked another wire, muttering to himself, "Let's try rerouting this baby." The aliens stared in wide-eyed horror. Is this truly the human method of crisis management? Oh yeah, the human replied casually, twisting a loose bolt back into place. Adapt and improvise. It's kinda what we do. Besides, it's not like we have a ton of options, right? Meanwhile, the temperature monitor showed an alarming spike, but after another twist and a few more sparks, it began to settle back down. The alarms dimmed and the readings started to stabilize. For a moment, it appeared the situation might actually be under control. One technician murmured, "Impossible, it's actually working." Another alien, struggling to comprehend, muttered, "But this isn't in any of our protocols. This isn't logical." The human chuckled. "See, that's where you guys keep tripping up. Logic's great and all, but sometimes you just need a bit of good old elbow grease." He slapped the control panel for emphasis, which prompted a new alarm to go off. An alarm indicating a malfunction in the oxygen system. An alien technician gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Human, you've triggered a depressurization protocol." The human took another sip of coffee. "Right, I figured that might happen. All right, let's go fix it. No biggie." The aliens were practically trembling as they followed him, utterly unable to comprehend his calmness in the face of yet another crisis. They stumbled through the hallways, keeping a wary distance as the human led them to the oxygen control room, where the alarms were now shrieking at an ear-splitting volume. He surveyed the system, scratching his head. "Okay, looks like we've got a minor leak here. Nothing a little quick thinking can't handle." He reached into his tool belt, this time pulling out a roll of something shiny and flexible. The aliens blinked, realizing with dread that it was aluminum foil. What are you doing with that?" one officer demanded, horrified. The human grinned. "Trust me, this stuff is magic." He began wrapping the foil around a cracked oxygen valve, sealing the leak with a few strategic twists. To their astonishment, the pressure stabilized, the alarms quieted, and the system seemed to return to normal, albeit temporarily. One officer finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "You humans, do you always use such primitive solutions?" The human shrugged, grinning. "Only when they work." He glanced back at the aliens, noting their mix of awe and confusion. "Honestly, you guys should try it sometime. Simple solutions can be surprisingly effective." They stood in silence, struggling to process this philosophy. One alien muttered, "But this goes against everything we've been taught. We were trained to calculate, to measure, to analyze every risk. And how's that working out for you right now?" the human interrupted, smirking. He pointed at the display. "Hey, look, system's stable, not bad, right?" The aliens exchanged looks, now torn between their adherence to protocol and the undeniable results of this human's bizarre methods. But before they could process it fully, a loud crackling sound echoed through the control room speakers. "Alert," a robotic voice droned. "External hull breach detected in Sector 7. Immediate action required." The alien officers all turned to the human, dread and hope mingling in their expressions. He sighed, setting down his coffee mug. "All right, guess we're doing this again." He grabbed his toolkit and headed for Sector 7, the aliens following him like nervous ducklings trailing after their parent. When they reached the hull breach, the situation looked grim. Alien technicians were frantically running simulations, studying graphs, calculating equations, while the humans simply examined the breach with a critical eye. One alien was hyperventilating, muttering, "This is it, we're done for, there's no protocol for this." The human clapped him on the shoulder. "Hey, breathe, I've got an idea." He reached into his toolkit and pulled out a simple patch kit. One of the officers gasped. That's impossible. You can't seal a hull breach with a patch. We need a full containment procedure reinforced by—" "Shh," the human said, gently pressing the patch over the breach. "I know it looks too simple, but give it a second." He smoothed the patch down with a practiced hand, then took a step back. To their disbelief, the pressure readings normalized. The aliens stared at the patched-up hull breach, blinking in astonishment. One technician whispered, It worked." The human shrugged. "Yeah, well, it'll hold for now, long enough for us to figure out something more permanent." He glanced around, amused by their stunned expressions. "You know, you guys really overthink things sometimes." One alien officer, almost admiringly, muttered, "You humans, you seem to solve problems without actually solving them, just delaying them. The human laughed. Yeah, I guess you could say that. We're pretty good at buying ourselves time. Despite the mounting chaos, the aliens began to see a pattern. This human wasn't operating by their rules, but he had a rule all his own: make it work, no matter how. And somehow, his chaotic methods were keeping the station intact, one patch and one twist at a time. They watched as he moved to yet another failing system, his calm demeanor almost unnerving. He jerry-rigged connections, slapped on makeshift fixes, and even wedged a broken panel shut with a wrench. Finally, one technician couldn't hold back any longer. Human, do you actually have a plan for all this? The human chuckled, grabbing a spare piece of wire. Plan? I'm just getting started. Besides, sometimes the best plan is to not have a plan. He grinned at the aliens, who could only stare back, bewildered. As they watched him fix one system after another, a strange feeling began to wash over them. It was something they hadn't experienced before in such a situation: hope. Against all logic, they were starting to believe that this chaotic, duct tape-wielding human might actually save them. And in that moment, as another alarm blared to signal yet another failing system, one alien dared to whisper, Perhaps there is something to this human method after all." The human overheard, chuckling as he tightened a bolt. "You're getting there, buddy, you're getting there." As the human engineer continued his patchwork repairs, an unusual silence fell over the alien crew. They had started the day convinced of their superiority, their protocols, and the unassailable nature of their technology. Now they found themselves watching, in awe and disbelief, as a single human with seemingly no plan, or a plan they couldn't comprehend, was holding their station together with tape, patches, and what appeared to be sheer stubbornness. One technician, who had been furiously taking notes throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up. "Human," he began cautiously, do you have a name for this approach of yours?" The human paused, wiping a smear of grease off his cheek. "A name?" He thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Nah, not really. We just call it making do. It's kind of the human way." He grinned, as though that explanation was supposed to make everything clear. But to the aliens, this concept was revolutionary. Making do? It sounded so reckless, so unscientific. But somehow, it worked. One officer turned to his colleague, a hint of wonder in his eyes. "Do you think, perhaps we have underestimated humans? That there is some hidden wisdom in this making do?" The other officer nodded slowly, unable to look away from the human who was now crawling under a console to reach a broken valve. "It is humbling, is it not? We thought them simple, even primitive. But here he is, adapting to each problem as it arises, without a hint of fear." The technician, who had been taking notes, couldn't help but reflect aloud. "Our protocols would have paralyzed us. We would have spent hours calculating every possible risk, and by then the reactor would have failed. But this human, he simply acts." As they watched him twist wires and tighten bolts, their minds began to race with questions they had never considered before. "Is it possible," one officer mused, "that flexibility is a strength? That perhaps there is more to survival than rigid order?" The director of crisis protocols, who had long held an unwavering belief in the Council's methods, found himself grappling with a deep, unsettling realization. Our protocols have kept us safe for centuries, but perhaps they have also made us inflexible. Perhaps we have relied on them so much that we have forgotten how to adapt. Another technician, his eyes wide with an almost religious reverence, whispered, "What if this human has revealed a flaw in our way of life? That our obsession with perfection and order has limited us?" They looked at each other, each alien wrestling with the same thought. The human, blissfully unaware of the existential crisis he was inspiring, was now rummaging through his toolkit, whistling a little tune to himself as he worked. One alien, emboldened by the revelation, dared to ask, "Human, do you not fear failure? Do you not worry that your actions could make things worse?" The human laughed, leaning back to look at them. "Oh, I definitely might make things worse. But if you worry about that all the time, you'll never get anything done. Sometimes you just gotta go with what feels right and deal with the mess later." He grinned, adding, Besides, where's the fun if everything's all neat and perfect? The aliens were floored. Fun? In the face of disaster? They had never considered that such a perspective could even exist. To them, fun was irrelevant to survival, and disaster was something to be avoided at all costs. And yet this human seemed almost invigorated by the challenge. One technician finally voiced the question they were all too afraid to ask. "Human, do you enjoy this? Do you thrive in chaos?" The human thought about it, his eyes gleaming with a mischievous light. "Yeah, I suppose I do. It's kind of our thing. You see, back on Earth, nothing ever goes according to plan. So we learn to roll with it, adapt, improvise, make things work, even if they're a bit messy. In a way, chaos is just an opportunity to get creative." The aliens exchanged stunned glances, his words resonating with them on a level they couldn't fully explain. Chaos as an opportunity? They had spent their lives viewing chaos as the enemy, something to be conquered with precision and order. But here was this human, embracing it, as though it were an old friend. Finally, one officer, his voice trembling with awe, murmured, "Perhaps we have been too rigid, too controlled." Another officer, who had previously scoffed at the humans' methods, now looked on with newfound respect. "We have always believed that our protocols would protect us from every possible disaster. But perhaps there are disasters beyond calculation, crises that require something more." The technician who had been taking notes was scribbling furiously now, his mind racing with the implications. Perhaps adaptability is as important as preparation. Perhaps there is wisdom in this human's chaos. As the human continued working, the aliens found themselves contemplating their own lives, their own rigid adherence to protocol. What would it mean to embrace uncertainty, to trust in their own instincts instead of a set of pre-calculated rules? One alien spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. "Human, you have taught us something today, something we did not know we needed to learn." The human chuckled, glancing back at them. "Glad to help. Sometimes the best lessons come from just winging it." He grinned, then added, "Hey, if you guys want to write that down as a protocol, feel free." The aliens actually laughed, a sound that was rare among them and usually reserved for moments of great achievement. But this laugh was different. It was one of realization, of enlightenment, and perhaps of freedom. They had always thought of humanity as a young, reckless species, one that hadn't yet learned the value of caution and control. But today, they saw them as something else, resilient, adaptable, and in their own way, wise. As they stood there, pondering the implications, the human gave them one final piece of advice. "You know, things don't always have to be perfect to work. Sometimes, good enough really is good enough." One technician, visibly moved, whispered, "Good enough?" The human nodded, his tone light but his words carrying a weight they all felt. "Yeah, good enough to keep going, good enough to survive. You don't always need a perfect plan. Sometimes you just need a bit of grit and a willingness to try." The aliens felt a profound shift in their perspectives. They had always sought perfection, convinced that anything less would lead to disaster. But this human had shown them that survival wasn't about flawless plans. It was about adaptability, resilience, and the courage to face the unknown. One of the officers finally turned to the others, his eyes shining with a newfound sense of purpose. Perhaps it is time to reevaluate our protocols, to incorporate flexibility." Another officer nodded solemnly. "Yes, perhaps there is wisdom in this chaos. Perhaps humanity has shown us a new path." As the human finished his final repair, he looked around at the silent, reflective aliens. "You guys good? I think we've got everything patched up for now." One alien, on behalf of the group, stepped forward and bowed slightly, an expression of deep respect on his face. "Thank you, human. You have given us more than just a solution. You have changed us." The human grinned, giving them a casual salute. "Anytime, just remember, sometimes the only plan you need is the one you make up as you go." He winked, his tone light, but his words had left an indelible mark on their minds. As he packed up his tools, the aliens stood in silence, each one lost in thought. They knew that their lives, their entire way of thinking, had been altered by this strange, duct tape-wielding earthling. They watched him go, their minds still spinning with questions. They wondered how they could apply what they had learned, how they could embrace flexibility in a society built on order. And as the human finally disappeared from view, one alien turned to the others and murmured, This is not the last time we will call upon humanity." The others nodded, each one realizing that this human had done more than just repair their station. He had introduced them to a new way of thinking, a way that perhaps could change their future forever. Just as the aliens were beginning to understand and appreciate the human way of thinking, a new, even more urgent crisis erupted. Alarms began blaring again, but this time louder and more frantic than ever before. Lights flashed red, and warning messages scrolled across every monitor in the control room. The aliens turned to each other, wide-eyed, the panic creeping back into their expressions. They glanced at the human, now their unofficial guide through these chaotic times, hoping he had yet another clever fix up his sleeve. The human sighed, clearly less surprised than the rest of them. "All right, what's the situation now?" One of the technicians scanned the monitors, his voice shaking. "It appears we have a cascading failure in the station's cooling systems. The core temperature is rising beyond control. If we don't act immediately, it will cause a critical overload." The human raised his eyebrows, clearly intrigued. "A cascading failure? That's a new one. All right, let's see what we can do." He rolled up his sleeves, glancing around the room at the group of aliens who looked back at him, waiting for instructions. He motioned them closer. "All right, folks, here's the plan. Actually, scratch that. We're making it up as we go. You with me?" The aliens, normally bound to a strict hierarchy, hesitated, but they looked at one another, remembering everything they'd learned from him. One by one they nodded, a determination sparking in their eyes. "Yes," one officer said, stepping forward with a newfound confidence. "We are with you." The human grinned. "Good. Let's get messy then." He gestured toward the cooling system controls. "First order of business, reroute whatever power we can to the cooling units. I don't care how, just make it happen." The technicians sprang into action, typing commands and pulling up every bypass and backup system they could find. One alien nervously called out, "But we don't have a protocol for this. We've never done a manual reroute on this scale." "Then make one up," the human said with a wink. "Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to work." The aliens hesitated, then nodded, each one tentatively embracing the idea of good enough. With swift fingers and a bit of improvisation, they rerouted the power, diverting every bit of available energy to the failing cooling system. For the first time, they didn't run simulations, didn't double-check every calculation. They simply trusted their instincts. As the cooling systems roared to life, the temperature gauge on the core dropped slightly, but it wasn't enough. Alarms continued to flash, and the core was still dangerously close to overheating. One officer turned to the human, panic flickering in his eyes. "Human, this isn't enough. We need another solution, something more extreme." The human looked around, his mind racing. "All right, new problem, new fix. If we can't cool it down fast enough, maybe we can release some of the heat instead." The aliens looked at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Release the heat?" one of them asked. The human nodded. "Yep, every reactor I've worked on has a pressure release valve or something similar. You've got to have something like that, right?" One technician's eyes lit up. "Yes, there's an emergency venting system, but it's only meant to be used in extreme cases. Activating it would breach multiple security protocols." The human smirked. "Well, sounds like now's a good time to break a few rules." He clapped his hands together. "All right, let's vent this thing before it takes us all out." The technicians hurried to the control panel, initiating the override process. But as they worked, yet another alarm blared. This time, the station's artificial gravity began to fluctuate. One of the officers shouted, "The emergency power reroute has destabilized our gravity systems. If we lose gravity control, the entire station could collapse." The human gave a quick laugh. "Well, let's hope this isn't your first zero-gravity rodeo." He braced himself against a wall as the gravity began to waver, while the aliens scrambled to hold on to any surface within reach. One by one, the aliens drifted up into the air, struggling to keep their focus as they floated in the microgravity environment. Some of them clung to consoles, Others drifted helplessly. But they could all see that the human remained calm, his focus unwavering. He shouted over the alarms, "Remember what I said, stay flexible, don't fight the chaos, just work with it." Taking his advice to heart, the aliens slowly adapted, using handrails and straps to anchor themselves as they continued working on the venting system. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't elegant, but it was working. And for the first time, they found themselves moving with the chaotic environment instead of trying to control it. After a tense few minutes, one of the technicians called out, "The override is complete. Initiating venting sequence. Now!" A deep rumble echoed through the station as the emergency vents opened. They watched on the monitors as superheated gas escaped into space, the core temperature finally dropping to safer levels. A collective sigh of relief swept through the control room, but it was short-lived. The human, always one step ahead, pointed out a new problem. Hate to break it to you, but that venting just knocked out your navigation controls. We're drifting." The aliens looked around in renewed panic. They were caught in a rapidly decaying orbit, and without the navigation system, the entire station was at risk of being pulled into the gravitational field of a nearby planet. The human cracked his knuckles. "All right, final stretch. Here's the plan. We need to manually correct our course using the emergency thrusters. Anyone here know how to work those things?" The aliens exchanged nervous glances. "The thrusters are unpredictable. They've never been controlled manually before. If we miscalculate, we could spin out of control." The human grinned. "Good thing I've got experience with unpredictable. Let's get to it." Working together, the human and the aliens made their way to the emergency thruster controls. They strapped themselves down to prevent floating away and began coordinating each thrust, using brief, carefully timed bursts to stabilize the station's course. The human's instincts were invaluable, guiding them through every adjustment, every course correction, until they finally regained control. After what felt like an eternity, the station was back on a safe trajectory, and the core temperature had stabilized. The alarms silenced, and for the first time, the control room was quiet. The human leaned back, letting out a breath he'd been holding. "All right, folks, crisis averted. Not bad for a bunch of protocol-loving aliens, huh?" The aliens looked at each other, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and elation. One by one, they let go of their handholds, floating in the zero-gravity atmosphere, laughing, a sound that had rarely been heard on their station. One officer, still catching his breath, managed to smile. "Human, you have shown us that there is more to problem-solving than protocol. You have taught us the value of adaptability." The human shrugged, grinning. "Hey, that's just what we do. It's not about being perfect, it's about keeping things together long enough to survive." The technician, who had been taking notes throughout the ordeal, looked down at his scribbled observations, then back up at the human with newfound admiration. "Your methods may be unconventional, but they have saved us." The human gave a thumbs up. "Glad I could help, and hey, next time maybe you can save yourselves with a bit of duct tape and quick thinking, yeah?" The aliens exchanged glances, nodding in agreement. One of them even pulled a small roll of tape from his belt, holding it up with pride. "Perhaps we should keep a few of these on hand." The human laughed, floating there in the middle of the control room, surrounded by exhausted but grateful aliens. "Now you're getting it." As they drifted back to their respective stations, recalibrating systems and securing loose equipment, a quiet resolve filled the room. They knew that today had changed them, not just the way they managed crises, but the way they viewed themselves and each other. They had learned to trust, to improvise, and perhaps most importantly, to let go of the need for perfection. One of the senior officers, reflecting on the experience, turned to the human with a look of profound respect. "We have relied on our protocols for so long that we forgot what it meant to think freely. You reminded us of something valuable today." The human's smile softened. "Happy to help. Just remember, sometimes the only thing you need is a bit of grit and a willingness to try." They nodded, feeling a mixture of humility and pride. They had faced chaos and come through it not by their rules, but by learning to embrace the unpredictable. The human made his way back to his ship, waving casually as he prepared to depart. As he disappeared through the docking hatch, one officer turned to the others, his voice filled with quiet resolve. This experience, it must not be forgotten. We should incorporate what we have learned. Another officer, still gripping a roll of duct tape, nodded. Yes. From now on, let us leave room in our protocols for flexibility. As the humans' ship detached from the station and disappeared into the stars, they knew they had been changed forever. And in a way, they knew that humanity would always hold a unique place in their universe, not as reckless or simple, but as resilient, adaptable, and inspiringly resourceful. In the aftermath of the crisis, the control room was filled with an unusual quiet, a peaceful silence that settled over the crew as they processed what had just happened. They had survived, yes, but more than that, they had grown. They had confronted not only the failure of their protocols, but also their understanding of resilience, of adaptability, of what it meant to be resourceful in the face of chaos. One of the senior officers, who had been perhaps the most resistant to the humans' unorthodox methods, looked around at his fellow crew members. He cleared his throat, his voice wavering slightly. Today, we have witnessed something remarkable, something that goes beyond protocol and precision. The others nodded, a few of them still clutching their hastily assembled tools, makeshift fixes held together with tape and clamps. They glanced at each other, a sense of camaraderie born from the shared chaos they'd endured together. We have seen that there is more to survival than mere logic, the officer continued, his tone one of awe. There is a wisdom in adaptability, a strength in being willing to try, even when failure seems certain. One of the technicians, who had taken detailed notes of the humans' every action, held up his tablet, a faint smile crossing his face. I have documented every unconventional approach the human used. Perhaps it is time we rethink our protocols, incorporate some flexibility. Another officer, who had initially balked at the humans' disregard for their carefully calibrated systems, nodded slowly. Indeed, we should not see flexibility as a weakness, but as a strength, one that complements rather than undermines our ways. The group fell into a thoughtful silence, each one contemplating what this shift would mean for their society. They had always prided themselves on their structure, their predictability, but now they realized that adaptability was an element they had been missing, a missing piece that humanity, in all its unpredictability, had brought to them. One technician, a younger alien who had looked up to the human with awe, spoke up timidly. Perhaps we could keep a small supply of, what did he call it, duct tape? A few of the aliens chuckled, and the senior officer gave a nod of approval. Yes, and perhaps coffee as well. A reminder that sometimes the smallest comforts can bring strength in difficult times. They all shared a small laugh, realizing that, without intending to, they had come to adopt some of the humans' strange but endearing traits. They felt more united, more alive than they had in years. The experience had left a mark on them, not just as a crew, but as individuals. One officer finally spoke, his voice filled with a newfound humility. That human, he changed us. He taught us that sometimes it's okay to not have all the answers, that sometimes all you need is a willingness to try. The technician who had taken notes added thoughtfully, I used to believe that precision and control were the ultimate strengths, but now I see that adaptability is just as powerful. As the crew members drifted back to their respective stations, they noticed that their attitudes had shifted. They approached their tasks with a bit more ease, a bit more confidence in their own ability to adapt. And they no longer saw their protocols as the only way forward, but as guidelines that could evolve when the situation called for it. In the days that followed, the Galactic Council received numerous reports from the station, detailing the events of the crisis and the unexpected solutions that had emerged. The Council was initially shocked, even disbelieving, when they read about duct tape patches, improvised solutions, and a human who had disregarded every protocol in favor of winging it. But as they reviewed the data and listened to the testimonies of the crew, they began to see the value in what had transpired. One council member, reading the report with a mixture of curiosity and respect, turned to his colleagues. Perhaps we have something to learn from humanity, their resilience, their resourcefulness. It is not as chaotic as it appears. Another council member, nodding thoughtfully, added, "This human's methods may seem unorthodox, but they reflect a strength we have not fully appreciated, a strength born of adaptability." With unanimous agreement, the council decided to adopt a new directive, one that would allow for flexibility and improvisation in times of crisis. They named it the Human Resilience Protocol, a tribute to the Earth engineer who had shown them that survival was sometimes about doing whatever it took, even if it defied logic. Back on the station, the crew found themselves invigorated by the changes. They began running exercises that encouraged adaptability, brainstorming solutions that went beyond the confines of their usual protocols. They even held a small ceremony, placing a roll of duct tape and an empty coffee mug in their command center as symbols of their newfound mindset. One day, as they gathered for a training session, the senior officer turned to his team and spoke with a gentle smile. "Remember, our protocols are tools, not walls. We are not bound by them. We are capable of adapting." The team nodded, their hearts filled with pride and a sense of freedom. They felt empowered, knowing that they could face any challenge with resilience, that they had grown beyond their previous limits. As the weeks passed, they shared stories of the human's impact on their station, recounting his calm under pressure, his quick thinking, and his unwavering belief that good enough was often all you needed. His legacy grew among the crew, each member carrying a small piece of his philosophy, his humor, his courage. And for those who had worked alongside him, they found themselves recalling his words whenever they faced a difficult situation. When a system malfunctioned or a calculation didn't add up, they'd laugh and say, "All right, let's make it work." In time, the legend of the human engineer spread beyond their station, reaching other parts of the galaxy. Stories of his improvisation and daring fixes became tales of inspiration, a reminder to all that even the most advanced technology had its limits, and that sometimes all you really needed was a roll of tape and a bit of courage. One day, as the crew looked out at the stars, one of the technicians turned to the others, a quiet smile on his face. "Do you think we'll see him again?" The others smiled, a warmth filling their hearts. They knew that wherever he was, that human was out there, probably saving another station, fixing another reactor, and inspiring another crew with his unique way of doing things. And though they didn't have all the answers, though they still faced uncertainties, they felt ready, because they had learned to embrace flexibility, to value resilience, and to trust in their ability to adapt. As they stared out into the vastness of space, the senior officer spoke, his voice filled with a deep respect and admiration. "Wherever he is, I hope he knows that he changed us, that he gave us something we didn't know we needed." And with that, they returned to their duties, their hearts full of purpose, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them with the same resilience and resourcefulness that humanity had taught them. In the years that followed, the station prospered, facing every challenge with a mixture of logic and adaptability. The crew would tell new recruits about the legendary human who had taught them the value of flexibility, a story that became part of their training, part of their heritage. And so, humanity's legacy spread across the galaxy, not as a symbol of chaos, but as a beacon of resilience, a testament to the power of adaptability. And in the quiet moments, when they sipped their alien version of coffee or repaired a panel with tape, they would remember the human with a smile, grateful for the gift he had left them. Months had passed since the human had left their station, yet his impact continued to ripple through the crew and beyond. The Galactic Council's Human Resilience Protocol had officially been instituted across multiple stations, its adoption a quiet acknowledgement of the lessons that simple Earth engineer had brought to their world. On the station where it all began, the crew had changed in ways they hadn't fully anticipated. They had developed a culture that blended their structured protocols with an openness to improvisation, with the mantra, "Make it work," echoing through their halls. And in the heart of their command center, the small shrine, a roll of duct tape and a coffee mug, stood as a reminder that resilience often emerged from the most unlikely places. One day, a young recruit, new to the station and full of questions, stood staring at the shrine. An officer approached him, amused by the look of confusion on the young alien's face. "Sir," the recruit began, hesitant but curious, What is this?" He gestured to the duct tape and the mug. "I've read about humans, but I don't understand. Why do we honor this human?" The officer smiled, remembering his own astonishment the first time he'd seen the human at work. That human taught us something priceless, something we had forgotten in our quest for order. He showed us that sometimes survival isn't about following the perfect plan. It's about adapting to what's in front of you. The recruit looked intrigued. "But duct tape and coffee, these things are not advanced." The officer chuckled. "No, they're not, but that's the beauty of it. Humanity taught us that not everything has to be sophisticated to be effective. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most powerful." The recruit pondered this for a moment, then nodded, a faint smile of understanding beginning to form. "I see. So we honor him because he taught us to be adaptable?" "Yes," the officer replied, pride in his voice, "because in that moment of crisis he gave us a gift. He taught us to embrace chaos, to see opportunity where we once saw only problems. And that has made us stronger." The recruit looked around at the bustling command center, seeing the way his fellow officers worked with a newfound ease, an unspoken confidence. He realized that this human's influence ran deep, touching every part of their operation. The officer put a hand on his shoulder, his voice soft but resolute. "Remember this, young one. Our technology, our protocols, they are tools, but they do not define us. It's our ability to adapt, to face the unknown, that truly makes us strong." The recruit nodded, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't before. He gazed back at the shrine, realizing it was more than just a tribute to a human. It was a symbol of their own growth. As they returned to their duties, a quiet message arrived on the station's communication console. It was from the Galactic Council, notifying them of a nearby station experiencing a catastrophic failure. The protocols were already activating, but this time there was something different in their approach. The officer turned to the recruit with a small smile. "Well, it looks like we may have a chance to put our new resilience to the test. Ready to embrace a bit of chaos?" The recruit straightened, a look of determination in his eyes. "Yes, sir." As they prepared for the mission, the entire crew knew they were different from the team they had been just a few months ago. They were ready not only to face challenges, but to meet them head-on, with flexibility and the courage to improvise. The legend of the human's good-enough attitude, his calm in the storm, and his makeshift fixes, had become a core part of who they were. And though he was gone, his influence lived on, not only in the protocols they had adopted, but in the hearts and minds of every officer on that station. The aliens had found a strength they didn't know they had, a resilience they had once dismissed as primitive, but now revered as powerful. As they embarked on their next mission, one officer couldn't help but look out into the stars, imagining that human somewhere out there, fixing another reactor, drinking his coffee, and maybe even wondering if they'd taken his lessons to heart. In that moment, they knew that humanity would forever hold a unique place in their universe, not just as allies or collaborators, but as a source of inspiration. And with a quiet sense of pride, they realized that if ever faced with the unknown, they would be ready, because now they too could make things work, even if they didn't have all the answers. And so, humanity's legacy continued to spread across the stars, a symbol of resilience, adaptability, and the unshakable belief that no problem was unsolvable. And every time an alien reached for duct tape or poured themselves a cup of coffee, they would smile, remembering the human who had taught them that sometimes all you really needed was the courage to try.